So today is the launch of the highly guarded secret product from NVIDIA, the GeForce GTX 1660 non-Ti. Now there was a time when we would have called this the GTX 1660 Vanilla, but we'll just let that one go. The particular card in question today is the ZOTAC Gaming GTX 1660, which is quite a delightful little guy that packs quite the wallop. But before we get too much into the card itself, let's take a quick look at the core specifications of the GTX 1660 itself. Based on the 12nm 284 square millimeter TU116 GPU die, just like its bigger brother, the GTX 1660 Ti, but coming in with two less SMs with a total of 1408 Turing-based CUDA cores, but a slightly boosted base clock of 1530 MHz with a boost clock of 1785 MHz, but still staying within the same 120 watt TDP package as its bigger brother and the GTX 1060 class of GPUs that it's replacing. Meant by NVIDIA to replace the GTX 1060 3GB, I can say that I'm glad they didn't go down that road again, and instead went with the 6GB of GDDR5 at an effective rate of 8,000 megatransfers per second on the same 192-bit bus, resulting in a memory bandwidth that matches but slightly exceeding the 192.1 gigabytes per second, which is roughly the same as the GTX 1060 cards. They were 129.0 gigabytes per second. Either way, close enough. Yes, you heard me right, no GDDR6 here, and that along with the two short SMs are the key difference between the full-blown GTX 1660 Ti and the smaller but feisty GTX 1660. If you want a deeper breakdown on the GPU core architecture itself, along with details regarding how TU116 handles concurrent FP and INT operations like the RTX cards, but instead of using the tensor cores as its own dedicated capabilities, head on over to the review linked in the description that's for the MSI versions of this card. Now let's get to the card that ZOTAC created. The ZOTAC Gaming GeForce GTX 1660, which is a reference clocked $220 card, so all the specs that we just listed out are what this card is operating at. Starting at the back or the front, depending on how you look at it, I guess that's a perspective thing, but the I/O is clean and simple with 3 DisplayPort 1.4a connections, which are capable of adaptive sync, and 1 HDMI 2.0b. There are no DVI options available on this one, and it doesn't come with any kind of adapters, so make sure that you can accommodate this display connectivity. The back side of the card is clean, which is good since there's no backplate present, which quite honestly is fine for this price bracket, but many cards in this price range do have one as an option. The card is powered by a single 8-pin PCIe power connection, a bit more than what's needed, but to ensure a solid power delivery for the card. The cooler is absolutely adorable, and I know that's an odd thing to say, but look at how tiny and thick this thing is. The plastic shroud that has the ZOTAC Gaming and GeForce GTX logos on the side house dual fans that are a bit peculiar. They are both of different sizes. One is 80 millimeters while the other one is 70 millimeters, and that allows for both fans to be in place but not have the need to extend the cooler past the end of the card by much. I mean, it's like a hair long. The densely packed heatsink is fed by 3 6mm copper heat pipes that are connected to a copper base plate and contact plate for the memory components. The VRMs are not left out, as that portion of the heatsink comes down to make full contact with the power delivery to ensure that the entire card runs cool. Now there are no flashy RGBs on this card, and it's about as bare bones as it gets, but it does it in a way that's pleasing and in a premium look and feel kind of way. I can appreciate the capability of a card this size brings, as it comes in at roughly the same length of an ITX mother. Now let's take a moment to talk about the test bench that we're going to be testing the card along with the MSI Radeon RX 580 8GB Armor and the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1060 6GB Founders Edition card on. We tested all the cards on the latest drivers on our Z370 test bench, which consists of an EVGA Z370 Classified K motherboard, the Core i9-9900K at 5 GHz with no AVX offset, along with 16 gigabytes of G.Skill Trident Z DDR4 3200 memory, powered by Cooler Master V12 Platinum power supply, and all games were loaded from the crucial P1 NVMe SSD. We did include overclock results from a very mild overclock of plus 120 MHz to the core, resulting in an average clock speed of 2025 MHz, up from the average 1850 to 1900 MHz, and pushed the memory to 9000 megatransfers per second from the 8000, and that was reached with just a setting the power limit to 111%. With that out of the way, let's dive into the benchmarks, starting with 3D Mark Firestrike. This may not have been the best place to start because, quite frankly, the 1660 at stock anyway is quite underwhelming. In fact, it comes in under the RX 580, but does edge out the 1060 by quite a good margin. However, once overclocked, it leaps out and ahead of everything, so that's good to see there. But when you move things over to TimeSpy, things get even more interesting, showing the benefits of the new Turing architecture with the next generation APIs, and you see a huge lead in stock and overclocked over the other cards there. Now let's dig into gaming performance, because that's quite frankly why you buy this card, not for the benchmarks. Kicking things off with Hitman 2 at 1080p ultra settings, we see the 1660 and the 1660 overclocked coming out with a healthy lead over both the RX 580 and the GTX 1060. Again, that's 1080p ultra settings. And Hitman 2 is only running in DX11, which is a bit odd since the original Hitman, well, the original remake, reboot Hitman came with DX12 and DX11. So that's a very interesting thing. But speaking of DirectX 12, let's move on to Forza Horizon 4, where we see the stock clock GTX 1660 come with a very healthy lead over the 1060, but barely edging out the RX 580. Apply a bit of an overclock, and that lead extends greatly. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was probably one of the most interesting results that I've seen in any of these, because I ran this test probably more than any other test just to revalidate all of these numbers, and truthfully, the overclocked 1660 is leagues beyond even the stock clock 1660. A 17 FPS average gain is a bit on the extreme end, so don't think that's going to be very typical, but it is interesting to see in that game, which leads me to believe that at DX12 with high settings, we're looking at a pretty heavy memory bottleneck there. Rainbow Six Siege is a game that typically favors Radeon cards, but we see here at 1080p Ultra that the 1660 edges it out by a substantial margin. And once overclocked, we break the 200 FPS margin on that. So, you know, that 240 Hertz monitor we just took a look at not too long ago would probably fit really well there if Rainbow Six Siege is your game. Far Cry New Dawn at 1080p Ultra shows, well, again, pretty healthy leads, especially taking into consideration the FP16 support that GTX 1660 and the Turing architecture bring to the table. It definitely shows good results there. Moving on to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, we see again a very healthy lead in this game. So going from right at 60 FPS on average all the way up to 70 plus. And even again, when overclocked, that lead extends even more. Total War Warhammer 2 at DX12 Ultra was a bit of a beast to get running. It took the 1660 to be overclocked to break the 63 or 60 FPS average. But you can see there the 0.1% lows are pretty low in that game, but that's just how it is in that game. Battlefield 5 at DX11 Ultra shows some strengths on the Radeon side. It shows the RX 580 competing and still edging out the 1660 at 1080p Ultra, and taking it, or needing the card to be overclocked in order to edge out the RX 580. Goes to show what an API that, or an engine that does favor Radeon, can show those cards still being pretty competitive. Metro Exodus, however, shows the 1660 returning to well on top with a pretty healthy lead over the 1060 and the RX 580, and again, extending that lead when overclocked. Resident Evil 2 is a game that does definitely benefit on the Radeon cards, and it definitely prefers them even in DX11. Now with maximum settings, so, well, one thing we didn't do in our original benchmarks was let things go to the wall, and this is what happens. And it shows here that the 1660 picks up some ground over the 1060, and when overclocked, carries a healthy lead. Looking again at Devil May Cry 5, which is the exact same engine, so this is almost redundant on here, but it shows you in the newer games that it does benefit quite a bit on the newer architecture. So DX11 highest settings with no variable settings enabled shows a 10% lead on the 1660, and even more so, once overclocked, it extends to nearly 20%. So there goes the gaming performance. Let's take a quick look at thermals and power load. Now, as we're looking at the thermals chart, I want you to take into account that the thermals do differ greatly depending on the type of card that you're running. And the most important metric here is the 1660 at stock, and then once it's overclocked, and how tiny that cooler is, it's really impressive that it's able to run that cool. But moving on to power draw, that's a huge boon for this card. Big gains there, seeing as how it's exactly on par with the 1060, a little bit higher on idle for some reason, but full system load is 195 watts at stock and 200 watts at full load, and that is running Unigine Valley for about a half hour and letting thermals kind of peak out and everything, showing, well, 200 watts with a Core i9-9900K at 5 gigahertz. That's a good power draw number to see. But where does that leave this tiny little bugger? I mean, look how little it is. It's so tiny. You wouldn't think that it would really be able to do a whole lot, but just by looking at it, but it is quite capable. The GTX 1660 shows that even with GDDR5, the Turing architecture is a pretty good improvement over Pascal, because this compared to the 1060 was running very similar clock speeds, and this one has just over 100 CUDA cores more. So it's not like it's a vast improvement. So 1280 to 1408, not a whole lot of difference there. So at the end of the day, the performance is great. If you're looking for a really small card to fit in just about any kind of build, you can't really go wrong with the ZOTAC GTX 1660. Still trying to get used to the naming on that one, guys. Really do apologize for that one. But let us know what you think about the ZOTAC GTX 1660. Maybe if I say it enough times, I'll finally get it down. But it definitely gets my approval and my recommendation. Again, coming in at the base price, I really don't see a lot of reason to spend a whole lot more than what it cost for the 220. Because at $220, it's a really good value. Honestly, out of the 1060 and 580, I think its biggest competition is going to be the RX 570 at its recent ridiculously bottom barrel pricing. So let us know what you think about those. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next video.